Hi, welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined gratefully by Kemi Ingram. Kemi is an Orthodox Christian educator, a writer, an advocate, and a homeschooling mother of three. Since 2005, she's worked to mobilize parents around issues affecting children and families, and she holds a bachelor's in public policy, management, and planning from the University of Southern California, and a master's in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, and another degree in applied theology from Oxford University. It's a wonderful rounded academic history. And then beyond that academic history, just if we may, then Kemi, can you tell us a little bit about your background and some of the key events in your life really that have formed you and your love for Christ and his church, if you might put it that way?
Sure. I think to answer that question, I have to maybe go back a bit to talk about my childhood and upbringing and the kind of faith environment that I grew up in. I was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area and in an environment of ardent religious pluralism. So very spiritual, but not religious.
Yeah.
Long before that became a thing. Jesus was there, just one of many options. There was a belief in God, but no real grasp on the claims of exclusivity, the Christian claims of exclusivity. And so we had in our home a King James Bible, we had a Jehovah's Witness Bible, we had a Quran that had been given to us by fellow, I think, classmates. I lived in a university environment. We had teachings of some Swami, someone, that's what I grew up in.
Yeah.
And so again, there was God, but Jesus was just an expression of something that was represented by all of the faiths. I went to camp, Christian summer camps, and at camp I would say the sinner's prayer and accept Jesus into my heart. And then I would go back home to my pluralist environment and just kind of go on about things. And then the next summer I would go back to camp and accept Jesus into my heart again. And it's sort of cyclical that way. And so, I didn't really come to faith, a full understanding of faith, until I got to college. And that's where I realized that I had some real ideas about Christians and Christianity that hadn't actually come to the surface, but I became aware of them once I started to be evangelized by campus ministries. So when people would say, oh, you have a God-shaped hole in your heart that can only be filled by Christ, I said, maybe you have a God-shaped hole in your heart. That I cannot relate to that at all. But God had a sense of humor, and he gave me a Christian Korean roommate who was an evangelical. And I watched her because I realized that I had come away with an idea that Christians were all hypocrites. I did not understand that Christians were sinners. It was, to be a Christian meant that you were perfect and kind of living a double life. That's I don't know where I got that, but that's what I had. And so I watched my roommate, waiting for her to do something to confirm the biases that I had about Christians. But what I found was that she was going through a really, really tough time. And something that she had allowed her to weather this really rough storm, this really rough patch in her life. And I came to the realization that I did not have that. I was happy. I was fine. I thought I was a good person, but I didn't have that. I hadn't experienced what she was going through, but I know that if I were in her position, I might not have that peace that passes all understanding that she seemed to have. And so that got me curious about Christianity and faith. And it was through that witness, her witness, not being pushy, always just being there to answer questions if I had them, extending the offer to come to church if I wanted to, but no, you don't have to come. I ended up in church, and that's where I was baptized as an evangelical back in the late 90s as a college, after college. So that's how I came to faith.
Fantastic.
How I, got further into faith came later.
Yeah, fantastic. And can you tell us a little bit about that next step, as it were, and what first prompted your interest in studying Orthodox theology in particular, which might surprise some people, and then even beyond that, education and some of the central concerns that we see in your work now?
Yeah, so once I got plugged into the evangelical church that I was a part of, I saw sort of a radical transformation in my thinking. I had a full paradigm shift in how I thought about the world, how I thought about, family, myself, my career. All of it was just kind of turned upside down by scripture and teaching of the church. And so, in seeing that, I just really fell in love with Christianity. I fell in love with Jesus, and I just wanted to learn everything I could about the faith. So I applied to Fuller Seminary with no expectation. I had no desire to be ordained. No, I did not feel called to any sort of pastoral ministry at all. That was never, I just didn't feel called to that, but I just wanted to learn about this faith that I knew could transform people's lives. And, these miraculous stories of transformation that I'd heard, I just wanted to learn more about it. And so I began to study at Fuller and eventually graduated with my master's. And, the academic side wasn't as hard as the spiritual deconstruction that happened in seminary. And for the first time, I had been in a room with people that ran the full gamut of the Christian experience. It was a multi-denominational seminary. And so, you're there with Anglicans, Lutherans, Baptist, Church of the Brethren, like everyone. And it was, I didn't go to a denominational seminary. So I was exposed to all of, everyone's thoughts about things. And, it was the realization that we thought different things. We all shared a faith in Jesus, but what we thought about particular Bible passages was different. There were doctrinal issues that we did not share. And so I began to wrestle during that time with truth. Where did we get all of our denominations? From whence did they come? Why do we all think different things? And even though I had one church history course, it didn't do much in terms of my understanding of church history. And so I think that began a quest for understanding the roots of the faith and what was at the heart of it all. So I came to Orthodoxy. Even when I went on to Oxford, I went to St. Stephen's House and did my master's of second master's of theology. But even there, I hadn't fully grasped what Orthodoxy was. It was an Anglo-Catholic college at Oxford. But it just kind of went over my head. Went to Venice, stood at the tomb of St. Mark, still didn't make any sort of ancient connections. Went to Egypt, it did not click there. It was only when I did a homeschooling project with my kids on ancient history, and they introduced the Byzantine Empire. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be neat if we could find a Byzantine structure? Because they were describing Hagia Sophia. So wouldn't it be neat if we could, see a structure that was similar to that? And I don't know, did some Googling and ended up at an Orthodox church. And that moment I walked in and it was like, I heard angels singing. And during coffee hour, I began to talk to people who were really friendly. And I was asking them where they were from. And one person would say, oh, yeah, I'm from Bethlehem. And another said, oh, yeah, I'm from Damascus. And I'm from, and all of a sudden it was like, the map that's in some Bibles with the Apostle Paul's journeys, missionary journeys. It just lit up in my head. And I was like, oh no, are you kidding? Are you really kidding? You mean the churches are still around? I thought they had all died out, so that was my introduction to Orthodoxy. And I became thoroughly convinced during coffee hour that I had just somehow stumbled into the Church of the New Testament. And of course, later I understood where that all came from and the role of the apostles in establishing Orthodoxy. And it was just unbelievable that you could have that much formal training and still not even know the true roots of your Christian faith. So,
Glory to God, and that's an amazing story. Thanks for sharing, Kemi.
sure.
And then another strand within that that we're getting at then is this focus in education. So similarly, I found that I went through the whole academic process, even as a teacher, doing the PGC and everything, and it was never enough, as it were, that the modern mainstream view of education, and it was only post studies through researching classical education and different types of education and through conversations with friends and different people on the internet. And then I've seen what I think a more proper education looks like in terms of classical models and so on. I'd love to ask you a little bit about that and what sort of insights that you've drawn from some of those expertise and how you've adapted these into teaching even at home and things like that.
Well, classical education entered sort of our studies through a program that my two daughters were involved in through Biola University, and beginning to wrestle with understanding primary texts and really kind of getting at the heart of where things originate from was very impactful for us, because a lot of the mainstream conversation, modern mainstream conversation, kind of glosses over the foundational understanding of things that can happen. And so for us, even though I wasn't I call myself a semi-classical educator because I wasn't, strictly following the trivium, but we, incorporated, my kids went to Greek school for a while in London, and, a real in-depth study of the ancient world. And of course, with Orthodoxy, you got to go back. You have to go back before the Reformation and before the Great Schism. And so you find yourself studying a lot of classical texts. And it's just really convicted me that, more attention needs to be paid to that model of education, that there's something that is missing from a lot of modern mainstream approaches to education, and just being able to know the origins of things, that there's nothing new under the sun. A lot of these ideas are just simply being revisited and regurgitated and even prescribed, and you can expect them to have some of the same outcomes. So I think classical education teaches students how, not just what to think, but how to think and how to grapple critically with ideas.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kemi. And then another way I've got to know you is through your writing. I want to ask you about a few pieces, just so one being African American Orthodox Christians for Public Orthodoxy. So something that appeals to me for different reasons, coming from a Northern Ireland, like a background in Northern Ireland. We grew up, my mom's generation, they didn't have civil rights and everything like this, and there was a lot of parallels with the African American kind of story. And I grew up watching documentaries about Reverend Martin Luther King and so on and so forth, and how they would sing "We Shall Overcome," and then they would repeat that in Ireland in places like Derry City, and they would sing the same thing, civil rights protest. So ever since I was a teenager, I was really interested in African American sort of Christianity, generally speaking. But then I later became interested in Orthodoxy, and I'm fascinated by how these two come together. So just with some of that in mind, then I know in the popular culture, there's a lot of talk about Black history and so on. So I wanted to ask you, what's maybe good and bad about this American notion or construct of Blackness from maybe a more universal Orthodox Christian perspective, if that makes sense?
I think it's just that construction is very limiting. And what I tried to explore in that piece for Public Orthodoxy, which was actually the outgrowth of an ethnographic study that began when I was working on a doctoral program at SOAS in London, was getting at the heart of whether or not there was an essential Black orthodoxy, a Black Orthodox experience. Is there, not going in with the assumption that there was. And so in writing that piece, I had to examine, really look at the construction of Blackness. Is there a Black experience? How does essentialism play into our understanding of what it means to be Black in America? And what I found was that, and I think that was in 2018 that was published, I think, was that there are many ways to be Black. It does not mean a single thing. And just because someone is racialized as Black, it doesn't mean that they all have the same lived experience. And so I think that sometimes the assumption that everyone who is racialized as Black will come in to even Orthodoxy with the same background, the same narrative, the same reasons for being there, and with the same expectations, I think that's actually erroneous, fallacious, however you want to describe it. It's actually not real. The Black experience, if you will, is comprised of many individual Black experiences, and it will look different to each individual. And everyone doesn't have the same view about the world simply because they've been racialized as Black. You see, in the global Orthodoxy, you have a number of different ethnic groups that would be put in the category of Black. You have, Orthodox Kenyans and Orthodox Nigerians and, Orthodox African Americans, and they would all be put in the same category. But if you fail to look at how their culture intersects with Orthodoxy, you might be missing something. And you just cannot assume that everyone has the same perspective or view.
Thank you for that, Kemi. I think from my outsider perspective, I sort of appreciated that because of the distinct African American history, whereby a certain identity was robbed from people, so they lost touch with their heritage and distinct national identities. People couldn't tell whether they're their ancestors were from Nigeria or wherever the case would be. So it's a tragedy. You can see, obviously, then that this social construct came about. But then part of my concern was nowadays, whenever it is taken beyond that and brought around the world, and it tries to explain the different countries using these maybe cruder social constructions. So, for example, my wife is from Zimbabwe, and kind of in line with what you're saying, she's a very different culture, heritage, everything from people in Western Africa, Nigeria, and places like that. And to actually now in Britain, they talk about BAME, and again use these, I think, too crude, that just try to lump people together, which is, I think, unfair. Because again, even though it's well intentioned, it robs people of their distinct histories. And then I think the flip side of that is with whiteness is this crude conception too, because as I said about even growing up in Northern Ireland, we had this relationship of civil rights for some and not for others, but it wasn't along color lines. That you see these things that play out in different countries in different ways. It was along like religious or kind of political lines in our country. But yet nowadays, if people come, they will say, well, you're all white. And I'm just like, what the heck does that even mean? It's so ridiculous. But sorry to go off on there, but I'll just try to frame it, because from an Orthodox perspective, then I think we see this Pentecostal unity, if we might call it that, so unity in difference, where we each have our place within the universal story, and we're not all the same. We have our distinctions, but we make Christ the center, and that includes with ethnicity, cultures, and everything all made around him, if that makes sense. And in line with that, I wanted to ask you then, what are some of the ways then that you have seen this done, and what ways can it be done, I suppose, now as we seek to live out the Orthodox life today, if that makes sense?
I think some of the interesting things that I've seen are you see it in cultural festivals. I don't know if in Ireland the Orthodox churches have specific cultural festivals. Do you? Do you have? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen good examples of that where the various ethnic groups within the parish are celebrated. They may have a food festival or an art fair, and it just sort of celebrates the culture and shows that Pentecostal unity amongst various cultures represented in the church. I think it helps for parishioners to feel connected, to feel seen, to feel celebrated in the ways, the unique ways that God has made them and the cultures in which he has placed them, but recognizing that that is just a beautiful picture of God's diversity. But at the heart of it, he still remains at the heart. And I think it's important to celebrate that. There's no partiality shown. We're all created in God's image, and I think that just needs to be celebrated.
Excellent. And then I think so. We're talking about a quite extreme contrast between the Christian anthropology, view of human nature and everything else, history, how that plays out, versus what seems to be very common nowadays, which is labeled under critical race theory, which is a number of different things sort of playing out. But so I think that partly undergirds the popular Black Lives Matter movement. But I want to ask you how that contrasts with the proper Christian understanding that, of course, Black life matters, and what are some of the contrasts between Christian social justice and this modern movement, if that makes sense?
So if you're going to contrast some of the popular approaches to incorporating critical race theory with a biblical approach to understanding humanity, the idea that one particular race is an oppressor and the other race is a victim is just problematic for a number of reasons. And if you make that a perpetual state, that is just ridiculous, because the biblical witness does not attest to that. And at one time, one group can be an oppressor, and another time, another group can be an oppressor. But just the idea of agency, of personal agency, individual agency, being robbed by someone else, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. If you believe that all human beings are created in the image of God, if you believe that God is sovereign and in control of everyone's life, the idea that a particular race can have a position that can usurp the authority of God and destine someone to a perpetual state of victimhood cannot be balanced. Either God is sovereign and control and can take even someone in the most oppressive situation and elevate them to a position of prominence and authority, or he cannot. And I think that the way that critical race theory is presented, now mind you, critical race theory is something that I first became familiar with in grad school. And it was just one of many lenses that one could use to look at things. It wasn't prescriptive that everyone approach, race or history with this lens. It was just that some students were using this. Other students were using a feminist lens. That was not mine, but other students were. Some were using a Marxist lens. It was one of many lenses. So the idea that one has to use or employ critical race theory to address history doesn't make a lot of sense. How do you take this one approach to looking at things and then make that prescriptive and say that you cannot teach history if you don't have it? I'm not a fan of it because of the theological implications. And it's not that I don't know what it is, or, because that's, often hammered on people who are opposed to critical. It means that you don't know what critical race theory is. If you object to it, you don't know what it is. No, I know what it is, and I have problems with the essentialist aspects of it, and it doesn't resonate with my idea of who God is and what he can do for a group of people and what he has shown himself to do for people who have been oppressed.
Excellent, yeah. And another wonderful African American scholar who converted to Orthodoxy, a Reboto who recently died. I remember him writing this wonderful book about African American religion, and he shows clearly that the Christian story is what helped elevate the African American people up, as you're saying. And I think, as you hint at there, with there is a good authority and bad authority. It's whereas I think a lot of the emphasis nowadays seems to be all about power because of that anthropology that they have, and they don't have a conception that one can be in righteous authority and so on. And I think too about the kind of what strikes me is the kind of religious nature of people who are offering this as if it's a neutral thing, which I think is in line with your point. It's you're presenting it as if it's not a whole view of the cosmos and everything in it. Whereas for me now, the more I've studied Christianity, I had previously been interested in Islam and so on. Whereas I would look at these modern secularist movements as different religions, and I think the Bible warrants that because it's constantly talking about idolatry, and people will make these images and place them in the center. Sorry, it's a long long frame. So with that then said, I'm wondering how might Americans, and then of course Christians everywhere, get a balance between something which I think you highlight in part, which is most important, is this consistent life ethic, as they talk about. So how do we get the balance between the protection for the unborn, protection from police brutality, and protection from, of course, whatever white nationalist kind of factions that have sometimes found their home in Christian churches and even in the Orthodox Church?
I think it begins with a recognition of the inherent dignity and humanity of each individual, because the same recognition will warrant the protection of unborn life. The same recognition will warrant protection from life being taken from at the hands of a bad apple police officer. It's the same thing that will cause someone to take issue with any sort of white nationalism that seeks to diminish the humanity of someone of a particular ethnicity, as if they too are not equal in God's eyes. So it is a consistent ethic, if you will, that would cause one to be concerned about all of those things. It is the protection of that inherent dignity after you recognize that each person has that.
Amen. Thank you, Kemi. And another wonderful piece that you've written in, I'd love to speak about, is the Black Voices Missing from the Parents' Rights Debate then for the week, which you've started recently, which is fantastic. And hopefully it'll be blessed. So you talk about this false binary in the debate. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that's obscuring what are some really vital conversations, especially within the African American community?
Well, the false binary is that those who oppose critical race theory are all white racists, basically, that would be the only reason that you would oppose critical race theory. And it's because that particular theory has been conflated with a receptivity to the truths of history. So they've conflated the two. So if you reject critical race theory, you're rejecting teaching true history. And again, you can teach true history without using that particular lens to teach it. We've done it for years. So the binary is that those who oppose it are white and racist, and those who are for it are Black. That is not true. And it's partly because there have been a couple of voices that have gained some notoriety, some Black voices that have gained notoriety, just a couple, because of maybe social media virality. They've spoken at a school board meeting and got picked up and their voices amplified. But on the whole, a lot of Black voices were missing from that parents' rights debate, and it was being framed as just something of concern, white parents reacting to their children being taught American history. That's how it was framed. But the fact of the matter is that even though the wider objections in the Black community to critical race theory, that conversation was actually happening. There were a lot of Black parents who were opposed to it for a number of reasons. Some theological, for the theological reasons that I mentioned. Others simply because they feel that teaching that their children that they're victims undermines the narrative of Black excellence that we've seen. It undermines all of the accomplishments that Black people have made in America in spite of legalized racism. And so by emphasizing on those things, they don't want their children to come away with feeling that they are somehow disempowered or that they lack agency or that their students who, their fellow classmates that are white have some privilege that they don't have, that God gave them some privilege that they don't have. And they don't want it for that reason. And, you know, the pro CRT proponents will push back and say, well, that's actually not what's happening. But when you think about how that plays out in a classroom, you know, you have students who may walk away with, I saw one comment, someone said, well, wow, I didn't realize that we were actually superheroes. This was a person who would be racialized as white. He's like, wow, you know, we have a lot of power. And it's like, is that really what you want to tell people, you know, and have, you know, Black children walking around thinking that they're victims and powerless. So that false binary presents it that, you know, Blacks are for it, white parents are not. That's just not true.
Mm-hmm.
There are plenty of Black parents that are not for it.
Excellent. And something I also see online and so on is this kind of crude rejection as if it's not actually being taught. So I don't know, I'm not in America, but I know even I taught in London, and the schools there were definitely teaching. I remember I had to do a substitute lesson where they were teaching Peggy McIntosh, and this was before I researched it all, and they were not aware of what they were dealing with. And it's not framed as this is one approach amongst many. This is framed in a way that is like, this is what's actually true. Again, as we say, it's a new religion, as it were, and there's no question in the dogma. But I want to ask you then, how might Orthodox Christians give students a really unflinching view of, say, the more difficult parts of American history without using this lens? I know, for example, there's a wonderful historian called Dr. Wilfred McLeay who's written the book Land of Hope, and it's warts and all. It's definitely a quite balanced account. But I'm wondering, beyond that, have you seen good examples of how it might be done?
I think using primary documents is key. I had a conversation recently with someone who, very sweet, well-meaning. We were kind of talking about CRT a little bit, and you know, we're just getting to know each other. And she said that the teachers weren't allowed to teach history because of the backlash to CRT. It would mean that teachers weren't allowed to teach history. And my question was, I'm in Texas now, are students allowed to read the Texas Constitution? Because if they read the Texas Constitution, the slavery is explicitly spelled out in the Constitution. It's right there. Talks about slave owners not being able to free their slaves without permission from the government. Like, all of it is in there. You don't have to have CRT to teach the messy parts of history. If you go to primary documents, it's just not necessary. Read the Constitution, read the earlier foundational documents, read the writings of people during slavery. You can get a sense for what the institution was like. Read abolitionists, read civil rights, read Douglass, read Booker T. Washington, read these things. And you don't have to have a lens. I saw one teacher teaching on Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the approach they used was to use newspapers. You had white newspapers and you had the black press. Read both. How was it framed? How were the race riots framed? And discuss. There's no need for this lens that is being presented as being necessary to teach history. So if you're, Orthodox, you're learning, if you're an Orthodox student, you're going to learn this, you should be learning the same American history, and you don't have to use critical race theory to do it.
Thank you, Kemi. And then what are some of the central debates then between homeschoolers, different traditional Black Christians and conservatives in dialogue, maybe with Black progressives, if I may put it that way, and why are they vital then for America and for the church?
Well, some of the issues center on public education and what children are being taught. Gender ideology is a big one. How that's being framed, how that is being conflated with the Black American struggle. Dissecting Black Lives Matter. What does it mean? What does it mean to say that Black life matters? What does it mean to embrace the organization Black Lives Matter? And you have a lot of Black families that have been alienated from the Black Lives Matter movement, if you will, because of their expressed statement on the nuclear family. That was just off-putting for a lot of people. And so as they began to dig into what Black Lives Matter, the organization, stands for, they realized it didn't quite line up with their views. Do they believe that Black life matters? Absolutely. Do they support the organization? No. So that's one conversation. Another is just about the progress that's been made, or in some cases, lack thereof, since the civil rights movement. What were the intentions of the civil rights movement? How has that played out? What strides have been made since civil rights legislation? How has the African American communities progressed or regressed in some cases? Have things worked out the way the leaders thought they would? So there's a lot of conversation, but those are some of the things.
Brilliant, thank you, Kemi. And can you tell us a little bit about how the true and living God then has so often made a way out of no way for ancient Jews through to Christians, African Americans through the ages, and of course Orthodox Christians everywhere then?
Sure. I mean, in African American religious history, the story of the Exodus figures prominently, and it makes sense because here you have a people that were oppressed, they were in slavery, and God freed them and brought them to the promise. That narrative has been so crucial to African American Christianity and the idea of hope and God making a way out of no way. It can't be can't be overstated. That, along with the ways in which God made a way during the civil rights movement, you're talking about people that were subjected to just, intense brutality, and yet were able to go from a 20% literacy rate, I think, right out of slavery, to a 70% literacy rate in about 50 years. I think that those are the numbers. That's in a time when, laws were stacked against them, society was stacked, and yet the resilience that they had, empowered by faith. You cannot discount the role of faith in the African American struggle for freedom. It's God showing himself over and over again, the same way that he was faithful in the Old Testament, he's been faithful. And I think we kind of need to just keep remembering that God is faithful and is capable of taking situations and just turning them on their head and, doing amazing things.
Yeah.
We serve an awesome God.
Amen. And I even personally love to go back and read, say, Frederick Douglass, who's came to Ireland, actually had a very profound effect. There's actually a mural of him in Belfast in Ireland, and of course Booker T. Washington right through, and even those voices that aren't being heard, like Thomas Sowell and all today, and how God is working through some of those people through history. And I also was wondering, I don't know what you think of this. So I would love to see more, say, those who are teaching classical education to incorporate some of those figures like Douglas and Washington, if they're not already, to incorporate them into the canon, as it were, and Martin Luther King, and because it's flexible and can integrate different perspectives going across the ages. There's no reason why it should be stagnant, and so that's just my 2 cents in that respect.
Absolutely.
And another wonderful element then to your work, Kemi, if I might ask you about this, is so a few years ago, I did a social enterprise course, and we went and viewed different social enterprises, what they were doing, how they were serving the communities, and so on. And I know you've written a bit about this. You've written Sacred Space, Enterprise and Ethics, the challenge of doing business in the church. I want to ask you about that because I think there's some helpful models there. What is then this social enterprise, and why should we maybe embrace that in dealing effectively with some social challenges?
I was first introduced to social enterprise and social entrepreneurship at Fuller. It was a Baptist ethics professor who sort of took me from a dejected state. I had been in business before entering seminary, and I actually entered with the idea that I would have nothing to do with business again. I thought it was just, oh gosh, I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And he introduced me to the world of social entrepreneurship, and there was another professor that was doing Christian community development. And together, they let me know that there was a place for business and entrepreneurship in the kingdom, and that there could be kingdom benefit to having entrepreneurship, which is precisely why when I was baptized again as an Orthodox, maybe coming up on 9 years ago, I'm not sure. I took the name Lydia because of her role as a businesswoman. I began to think that social entrepreneurship was something that could transform a lot of the social problems that were kind of on my radar. And I visited a number of projects, got involved with Christian Community Development Association, ended up speaking there, I think in 2006, presenting a workshop on social enterprise. And I had become aware of a number of Christian ministries that were transforming people's lives, some formerly incarcerated that had come out and needed employment. And so they had created a product or a service that could be sold to help support their livelihood, and while they were also getting, ministered to through the church. So that was my introduction to social entrepreneurship. But then when I went to Oxford, I ended up writing my dissertation in business ethics, and I studied a number of social enterprise models and looking at the ethical challenges to some of the proposed businesses. There were some that were ministries that seriously needed to generate income because they were working with vulnerable populations, and charitable donations were it was not, in the US, we're encouraged to donate to charity. One of the things that I learned living in London was just some of the disincentives to charitable giving, like in terms of like your tax breaks and things like that we do in America. Mm-hmm. So churches were getting creative to try to finance their business, to finance their church. They dilapidated structures, or needing a van to do ministry. And so I looked at these different models and tried to determine where and how business might be able to help generate income from mission-driven programs and services. Some things I came across were absolutely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. One church, for example, they wanted to have a psychic hotline in the church, which presented a great study for, ethical challenge. Some were being hired out as yoga studios we talked about, that we worked through that. Others were, making crafts, handicrafts, and things, and selling them, jewelry and different sorts of things. And others were doing partnerships with mobile telephone companies and installing mobile masts in the church steeples. So the idea of what might be piped through the church via a mobile phone mast was a whole ethical can of worms. But I guess at the heart of it, it was using business to generate income for mission-driven programs and services. And there are a lot of people now that are doing great things, and have been able to create a stream of income to fund their ministry. And it's good, but I think that there are limits to what is acceptable in business. Now we have the challenge of churches that have, fallen out, congregations that have dwindled, and now people are converting them to condominiums, the entire church. And when you think of all of the sacred activity that has happened in that church, and that we should be a worshiping, a parish where people worship, and now it's, bedrooms and condominiums, you think about those things, and what social entrepreneurship can look like, and maybe what it shouldn't look like.
Absolutely. Even worse than that, I know in England, from when I lived there, a lot of the churches are now converted into nightclubs and things like that, which is quite disturbing.
No.
Oh dear. And I think, too, in line with what you're saying there's an element that, as we said, about different ethnicities and cultures, as long as Christ is the center, some of these business initiatives can be fruitful and serve the kingdom, as you suggest. Whereas I think it's wonderful anyway, the American Christian writer Eugene Peterson, in his work, he talks about this consumerist mentality and how it's at odds with the gospel, and how there's a temptation to try to run the church as a kind of business itself. And that's the problem.
It is. And that's why you have to explore, those limits, and see where not all business is good business, and the church is not appropriate for all types of business. And that requires some thinking about where those lines are drawn. Nightclubs, yeah.
Can I ask you then just a little more about your personal experience, and then good examples that you have seen, and what you have found most rewarding about incorporating some of those models for the church then? If that makes sense.
Some of the good models I've seen are bakeries. There's a pretty popular bakery in the Los Angeles area that takes former gang members, and they bake things and they sell them, and they have a very good product. I've seen another ministry that puts together dried soup and they sell dried soup, and those are, I think, women who had been on the street. These consumer goods that can be sold are great. I think when you start using sacred space for businesses, that can sometimes be problematic. Like, when you're actually using a part of the church for certain activities, his house shall be a house of prayer. You can see some tables being turned over with some of these things. So you got to watch it. But things like bakeries and products and things, those are probably really, really good. I've seen some cafes that they're not located inside the church, but they're church run, but on another structure, and they serve food and anyone can go eat, and they generate their income that way. Those sorts of things work really well.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Kemi. And then just sort of closing up for this evening then, is there anything else that you're working on now at the moment, or that you still feel the passion to get involved with in the future, that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I think now I'm doing a lot of writing. I've sort of stepped into that, a lot of like freelance journalism. So I just finished up a piece that should be out in a week or so. And that's sort of looking at how what Americans eat has changed over the last 20 years, and the way sort of our understanding of climate and human responsibility or human role in climate has kind of fueled a change in some of the products that we now have available. So I won't give away too much about that, but I just finished that piece. And so I think I'm concentrating now a bit more on writing and then advocacy opportunities. And homeschooling. I still have two more to homeschool. One just she's now officially in college. But yeah, I think that's kind of where I am.
Excellent. Thank you, Kemi. And I know from Ireland, I'll be looking forward to your different pieces now. I love them so far. So thank you.
Oh, thanks.
And then where can viewers or listeners then find out more about you and your work, Kemi?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Kemi Ingram, or you can go to kemiingram.com, and that's just a bit more about like my portfolio and some of the work that I've done over the years. And if you look at that, you may see a bit of a change in thinking about things because it spans a number of years.
Yeah.
And, I believe that we're all constantly learning, and, perhaps some things I thought back in 2006 or 2005, my views may have changed. If you find that, just go with it.
Fantastic.
But yeah. That's kind of where I am.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me today, Kemi. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and God bless you.
Thank you. You too.